I'm out on a bike ride on the northern end of Skyline Boulevard in Oakland, California, and found what I thought was something quite interesting. I can imagine a couple potential other uses for it, but the reason that this is in place, as indicated by the sign, is for firefighting. These hydrants are fairly decent distance apart, and you might wonder, why would there need to be a transfer between these two water systems? I don't know how this particular water system is set up, but with the infrastructure, but there's at least some water systems, if not the majority, the the pumping infrastructure between them doesn't necessarily have enough capacity to even meet normal peak demand. And so what they use is during the times when there is high demand, they'll be draining their reservoirs, and then during periods of low demand and low electricity prices, they will be pumping those reservoirs back up. Not to mention firefighting, which uses a lot of water, even on a relatively small house fire. Not to mention the potential for a wildfire, even a small wildfire, though large wildfires such as the Oakland Hills firestorm, which passed through this area almost 30 years ago. While doing research afterwards, I learned that where I was actually on the edge of where the Oakland Hills fire burned. I'm not sure just a little bit of extra water between these would really help. As explained on the sign, hooking up a fire engine between these two locations can allow water to be pumped in from this lower hydrant, which, to call it red, is really, it needs a bit more paintwork, to the upper white hydrant, with the space between them most likely about the length of a fire engine, such that it's fairly easy to run between them. That can bring the water pressure up to a point that it can be used in another part of the water system for fighting a fire, taking advantage of the existing pipe network of the water mains, because fire hydrants are directly connected to the water mains in most cases, at least like city fire hydrants. And instead of having to lay long periods of hose to pull water from a lower water system, if that would even be possible, or run tanker trucks, which in urban fire departments such as Oakland, I'm not really sure they would have enough tanker trucks to bring water. If any, I don't know what their firefighting infrastructure is. A rural department from where I am, a small town rural department will probably have two engines, one tanker truck, and maybe one auxiliary vehicle. I know my town certainly does, as do a number of towns around where I am. And they'll have one engine at the water source, the tanker truck running back and forth, and then one engine at the fire. And of course, anything more than a small fire, there'll be several towns responding. So you do get multiple engines and tanker trucks doing this. But an urban fire department almost certainly does not have many, if any, tanker trucks to run a fire in. So why are different water pressure zones needed? It has to do with being in a hilly area here in Oakland, with houses both at 1,500 feet as well as an ocean coastline. The East Bay Municipal Utility District, with a service area of over a dozen cities, including Oakland, has more than 130 pressure zones to properly serve the 1.4 million people in the 332 square mile area. Different pressure zones are needed so that infrastructure at the lower elevations of the service area does not need to be extremely overbuilt to handle the extreme pressures that would result in a single 1,500 foot pressure zone. Though those 130 pressure zones are not built purely for vertical differences, they are also due to spatial areas, so that you don't just have a single long pressure zone at each elevation. With water producing 0.433 psi per foot of head, over an elevation of 1,500 feet, it would have a pressure of 650 psi at the bottom, assuming static water pressure. That would mean that the pipes and other infrastructure would have to be much beefier and thicker to handle that extremely high pressure at the bottom than if there's separate water zones. Another reason to have separate pressure zones is to reduce the costs associated with pumping water. when water is pumped into a system, it doesn't matter where it comes out, it needs to be forced against the pressure in that system. Thus, if in a single large pressure zone, water coming into that system would need to be forced against the massive height at the top. With multiple pressure zones, that top water pressure at the top of the system with like the top pressure zone, the water's still going to be pumped up against that serving that pressure zone, but it doesn't need to be pumped against that serving the lower pressure zone, so there'll be less pumping costs associated with it. And depending on the elevation of the source water, which at least locally around here is at an elevation, you might not even need to pump it into a system. It can just gravity feed into it. Given that ebb mud supplies water to your house at between 30 and 130 psi, though your water meter will reduce that to your domestic water pressure, the 105 psi that you'd be pumping into this water transfer indicates that this is located near the bottom of the pressure zone.